Every person on Earth knows the Titanic sank. The most famous maritime disaster in history. The most famous ship in history. The one that became a symbol of hubris and class and the fragility of technology and the price of arrogance. 1,500 people died in water that was -2 degrees Celsius. They died in lifeboats that were only half full. They died because the ship was carrying 20 lifeboats when it needed 64. They died because 6 separate iceberg warnings were received that day and only 2 were read aloud to the officers who needed them. 6 warnings. 40 seconds. That is the margin between the most famous disaster of the 20th century and nothing at all. What if those 40 seconds went differently? April 10, 1912. The RMS Titanic departs Southampton for New York. The largest moving object ever constructed by human hands. 882 feet long. 46,328 gross tons. Carrying 2,224 people, 329 first-class passengers, 285 second-class, 710 third-class, and 900 crew. On board, American industrialists, British aristocrats, Irish emigrants selling everything they owned for a third-class ticket to a new life in America. The full cross-section of Edwardian civilization, stacked in descending order of income from the promenade deck to the forward hold. On April 14, the Titanic's wireless room receives 6 separate messages warning of ice in the exact waters ahead. The wireless operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, are primarily employed to transmit passenger telegrams. The commercial traffic is enormous, wealthy first-class passengers sending messages to shore about business and social arrangements. 2 of the 6 ice warnings reach the bridge. The others stay in the wireless room, technically received but effectively unseen by the officers who need them. At 11:39 p.m., lookout Frederick Fleet spots the iceberg. He telephones the bridge. Murdoch orders hard to starboard. The Titanic begins to turn. She turns for 37 seconds before the iceberg tears a 300-foot gash below the waterline across 5 compartments. The ship can float with 4 compromised compartments. 5 seals her fate. 37 seconds of turn. The difference between grazing and a fatal blow measured in seconds. In this timeline, Phillips passes the 6th ice warning to the bridge 40 seconds earlier. Murdoch orders the turn sooner. 37 seconds becomes 77. The iceberg scrapes the starboard hull, a graze that floods one compartment, causes no flooding of any others, and slows the ship for inspection. The inspection finds superficial damage. The Titanic continues at reduced speed and arrives in New York on April 17, 4 days behind schedule. 2,224 people go home. None of them think about it for very long. Near misses don't make headlines. Subscribe to the Alternate Archive, a new timeline opens every week. Here is the first counterintuitive truth about the Titanic surviving. The disaster killed 1,500 people. But the disaster also saved an uncountable number more, by forcing maritime safety reform that the shipping industry had successfully blocked for 30 years. In our timeline, the Titanic sinking triggered the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, SOLAS, signed in 1914. It mandated that every ship carry enough lifeboats for every passenger. It established 24-hour wireless watch. It created the International Ice Patrol. It defined distress signals and mandatory response protocols. None of that happens here. Without the Titanic disaster, the international maritime community has no political catalyst for reform. The same arguments that blocked SOLAS for 30 years, cost, competitive disadvantage, the industry's track record of relative safety, continue to block it. The regulations that would have saved thousands of lives in the years 1914 to 1940 are never written. In the first 15 years after the Titanic's safe arrival, maritime historians in this timeline estimate that between 2,000 and 4,000 additional people die in preventable maritime accidents on ships that would have had adequate lifeboats, functional wireless emergency protocols, and mandatory ice watch procedures in our timeline. The Titanic's 1,500 deaths brought safety rules that saved more than 1,500 lives. In this timeline, those people die instead. Quietly. Without a senator from Michigan to convene a hearing about it. The Titanic sinking was not just a maritime disaster. It was a cultural earthquake. The ship was a physical diagram of Edwardian-class society. First class had access to lifeboats and survived at a 62% rate. Third class did not and survived at a 25% rate. The locked gates between steerage and the upper decks, real, documented, contested at the inquiries, became the defining image of what class privilege actually meant when it was life and death. The Titanic disaster accelerated the already building labor movement in Britain and the United States. It arrived at exactly the moment when class consciousness was shifting, 6 months before a major British miners' strike, 2 years before the First World War would finish the job of demolishing the Edwardian social order. The disaster gave the working class not just a grievance but a story. A symbol. A number to point to. In this timeline, that story doesn't exist. The British labour movement still advances. History doesn't stop for a lack of one symbol. But it advances more slowly. The National Insurance Act of 1911 is already law. The movement toward universal suffrage continues. But the specific moral velocity that the Titanic gave British liberalism, the image of gates locked between decks while first-class passengers loaded into half-empty lifeboats, is absent. The social reforms of 1913 to 1918 arrive in this timeline, but 2 to 4 years later. Women's suffrage in Britain comes in 1922 rather than 1918. Not because one ship made the whole difference, but because symbols matter to political movements, and the Titanic was the most powerful class symbol the Edwardian era produced. The First World War still happens. Nothing about a ship surviving in 1912 stops the assassination of Franz Ferdinand in 1914 or the mobilization that follows. The underlying tensions, imperial rivalry, the alliance system, the arms race, the nationalism, are structural. They don't depend on a single cultural moment from 2 years earlier. But the war's political context is slightly different. In our timeline, the British soldiers who went to the Western Front in 1914 did so in a society already radicalized by the Titanic, a society that had spent 2 years debating class, privilege, and the differential value of human lives. The war's enormous casualties fell into that moral context and produced a specific political reaction, a generation that came back demanding the country be rebuilt on different terms. In this timeline, that moral context is slightly thinner. The demands are similar. The anger is real. But it has fewer years of accumulated grievance behind it. The practical differences are not large. The 1918 Representation of the People Act gives the vote to all men over 21 in our timeline. In this timeline, it still passes, but later, 1920. Lloyd George's coalition still collapses. The Labour Party still rises. The welfare state still comes. But it comes slower. And the years it takes to arrive are years in which the people who needed it most went without it. Not dramatically different. Just different enough to matter to specific people in specific years. So what does 2026 look like? The Titanic is still afloat. The White Star Line was absorbed by Cunard in 1934, as in our timeline, but in this one the Titanic passed into the Cunard fleet and was kept in service until 1960, then preserved by a maritime heritage trust. She is a working museum ship that makes 6 heritage crossings per year. $60 tickets. Always sold out. The world in 2026 is not dramatically different from ours. This is important to say clearly. One ship surviving one iceberg does not rewrite global civilization the way Alexander dying at 32 or the Mongols conquering Europe does. History has its rhythms. The First World War still happened. The Depression still came. The Second World War still happened, Hitler still rose, the Holocaust still occurred. None of those deep structural forces were caused by the Titanic or prevented by its survival. What changed is smaller and more human scale. Specific people didn't die. Specific people's grandchildren exist in this world who do not exist in ours. The Solar's regulations arrived in 1928 rather than 1914, triggered by a different disaster, a lesser-known one, that killed fewer people but was enough. The labor movement in Britain moved slightly slower. Women voted slightly later. And here is the strange thing about this timeline, almost nobody in it thinks much about the Titanic. In our world, the Titanic is a cultural monument because it sank. The disaster made it mythological. The wreck made it permanent. The James Cameron film made it impossible to forget. In this timeline, the Titanic is just a very old ship. A heritage attraction. A piece of maritime history interesting enough for hobbyists and not much more. In our world, it's everything. Symbol of hubris. Metaphor for the 20th century's relationship with technology. The moment the world learned that the grandest things could still fail. Maybe the Titanic needed to sink to become what it became. Maybe its meaning required its death. 1,500 people died so that the world would learn what happens when you put 20 lifeboats on a ship that needs 64. That is not poetic license. That is the actual mechanism. The Titanic's death taught a lesson. The lesson saved lives. The saved lives are not famous. They don't have films made about them. They are invisible, distributed across ships and years and regulations that became ordinary rather than mythological. The Titanic is the most famous disaster in history partly because it is beautiful. The ship is beautiful. The tragedy is beautiful, in the terrible way of things. And beautiful tragedies teach better than near misses. In the other timeline, the one where everyone lived, nothing learned. Which world would you choose to be born into, the one that paid 1,500 lives for the lesson, or the one that never learned it? I find that question harder to answer than it should be. Until the vault opens again, subscribe to the Alternate Archive.